Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
So this week, we go back into the narrative section of the book of Exodus, and we actually have a lot of formative moments for our people. Things that really stay with us for a very, very long time. More often than not, Parasha Ki Tissa, which is what we're reading today, is called the Golden Calf Parsha, because that's the main part of the story that we read today. It's actually not what we're going to talk about today. We talk about the Golden Calf a lot. I actually want to look at what I think from a spiritual perspective is an equally formative moment, and it's tied into, you're going to see indirectly, into the golden calf. This actually focuses not on the people as a whole, but on Moses as a leader and as a paradigm for who we are as the Jewish people. Let's look at chapter 34, which can be found on page 540. After the story of the golden calf, God turns to Moses and says, "Carve 2 tablets of stones like the first one, and I will inscribe upon the tablets the words which you shattered." It actually changes, and then it says Moses is going to actually inscribe the words that were on there as well. It's a little bit of confusion in terms of all of that. But in this moment that Moses and God are having this very intimate, very closed off conversation. The rest of the people are not there. This is just between God and Moses. We see as we turn towards the end of this chapter, hold on a second. We want hold on a second. This is the wrong verse here. 34. There we go. All right. We're going to turn to 545, verse 29. So Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and as Moses came down from the mountain bearing the 2 tablets of the pact, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant, since he had spoken with God. And Aaron and all of the Israelites saw that the skin of Moses' face was radiant, and they shrank from coming near him. But Moses called to them and said, basically, "Come close." So we have this moment of intimate conversation, and then Moses goes back to the people, and what's going on when Moses goes back to the people? They're awestruck by his appearance. And how does he look? He looks radiant. He looks radiant. He looks strange. Changed. Good. We're trying to figure out what this term means. Now, the Hebrew, by the way, many people know that the Hebrew, right, it says karnaim. It says that Moses is coming out with these rays, right, of light that are coming from him. It's the same Hebrew word as keren, as horns, right, which is where Michelangelo picks up the idea that Moses had horns, which, by the way, is where very often it gets picked up that Jews have horns. Add a little Satan in there as well, right? But it comes from this image. Now, before we actually dismiss it and say, oh, horns, does it really mean that? It doesn't mean that. Actually, the Talmud and the Midrash picks up and says there are 10 examples of horns in the Torah. 10 examples of horns in the Torah. And they name different ones, including the horns of the ram that was stuck at the binding of Isaac. 10 moments where horns play a role, and this is one of them. So even the rabbis actually kind of play with this idea of horns in a different sort of way. So we've got on the one side of our Parsha this moment, this intimate moment, and then we've got this other where Moses is coming down changed because of this intimate moment. Now there's a third piece that in order to understand, I think, this we have to get. When God and Moses are speaking, what happens? When God and Moses are speaking in this Parsha, what happens? Well, there's a couple of times, right? Let's go back. Let's go back just for a moment, and we'll add this third piece, which is, let's go to verse 17 on page 539. And the Lord said to Moses, I will do this thing that you have asked. You have truly gained my favor. And then Moses says to God, oh, let me behold your presence. And God answers, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name of the Lord, and the grace that I grant, and the compassion that I show. But God said, you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live. And the Lord said, see, there's a place near me. Station yourself on the rock, and as my presence passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. All right. How do these three things all work together in this Parsha?
I think I'm like looking up, and I have a different store, but where it says the Lord would speak to Moshe panim el panim.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a time where he was speaking. It says face to face, like someone speaks to a friend.
Right.
And now all of a sudden, this like relationship is starting to change.
So yes, there is another place where it says that Moses and God speak panim el panim, face to face, but most of the rabbis pick up on that and say that's a metaphoric face to face as opposed to a literal face to face. The only time that Moses and God saw each other face to face, the rabbis say, is at the end of Moses' life, and that is how Moses ultimately died, is seeing God's face.
I see it there's a lot of boundaries that are being set now, and so here's this like relationship boundary between God and Moshe, and then we're going to have this relationship between, well, even we had this relationship between the mountain and the people and the cattle and everybody. Like no one can even come near the mountain, and I see it as how everything works within these set of confines, if you will, but how it's actually really important.
So Diana is saying there's a lot of boundaries here, and everyone kind of has to stay in their lane, so to speak, almost, right? I mean, the people have boundaries of what they can do. Moshe has boundaries of what he can do. One could even potentially argue God has boundaries of what God could do, right? And so everybody has these boundaries. Okay. Anybody else? Levi.
I also wanted to note that on several occasions when Moses talks to God, he's talking to God when he is also feeling, when he's also showing another side of him, like judgment or anger or other things. But in this passage, he specifically says, all of my goodness will come before you. Only good, the merciful God that I want to show you, can you not see?
Interesting. So perhaps you're arguing, which is a very interesting, I haven't heard anybody say this before, Levi, right? That perhaps, we see the punishment, we see that aspect of it, but the full goodness of what God is, it's hard for us to see. And Moses was asking for this, okay? So I struggle with this on the one hand, but I also think it is so demonstrative of who we are as human beings. I struggle with this because I think that Moshe is asking God the very same thing that the children of Israel who built the golden calf was asking. Right? We struggle as human beings to connect with, to worship a God that is unseen, unperceived, or imperceivable by our human standards. And so the children of Israel struggled with that and needed to build this golden calf, this seen object, to be able to say, I can see it, I can prove it, I know where I'm supposed to focus to. And I would argue that Moshe is actually asking the same thing. Now we can play this two different ways. We can say, on the one hand, Moshe isn't any better than the children of Israel, right? And so then why wasn't Moshe then punished the same way? So I'm going to reframe it, and I'm going to say Moshe, as the leader, is coming to God and say, look, God, we human beings have a need. We struggle connecting to you in this ineffable, infinite form, right? We have a need. Please show us something. Show us something. And that's why I think God's response here is different. I think God heard that. So what is God's response? You cannot see me the way that I am. But what can we see? Say it again? Well, we can see the tablets, but even more than that, what did God show Moshe? His back. After he passed by. What do we do with that? So maybe this is a sign of compromise, right? That God was able to show a little bit of something, okay? Karina? Yeah. Right? We can see the after effect of God in our life. We can see the results of God's presence in this world, right? As we look and as we see the beauty of nature, and as we go, we can say, well, that's God's presence. We're not seeing God actively, but we're seeing the after image, so to speak, of God. So God is giving us actually a way to say, look, you can't see me directly, but if you look, if you take the time, you can see the impact of my presence. You can see the effect of my passing through this world in a lot of different ways. So that's step number one, and I find that to be extraordinarily powerful for us as human beings to be able to figure it out. But now let's go to this last little piece about Moshe, right? So Moshe now comes back, and even just from the after effect, Moshe was changed, right? He now had these rays. He was radiant. And, by the way, some people were afraid. That's what it said. Some people were afraid, and they wanted to stay away. But what's most interesting to me is when you look at the rabbis in terms of understanding this verse, Chizkuni comes and says the follows. Moshe was not aware that the skin of his face radiated light. When God placed his hand on his face to shield him when his glory had passed, he stood at the opening of the cave in the rock. He merited this reminder of the encounter. The reason that he merited this reminder, which he had not merited in the first set of 10 tablets, was that the first set of 10 tablets had been given publicly, whereas this was given privately. So what was different, right? Why didn't Moshe radiate after the first 10 commandments were given? Why only at the second 10 commandments? So Chizkuni's answer is, well, the first everyone knew. They felt, they were able to perceive God's presence. But of the second one, they needed to be able to see that. They needed to be able to perceive that in a stronger way. So Moshe radiated, but Moshe didn't know. How often do we as human beings help do things that are godly in this world, and we don't even realize what we're doing. We don't realize that when we're talking to our friend who's struggling and we say the right thing at the right moment that helps them, we don't always realize that impact that we've had on them at that moment. And I find this to be sublime. Because here was Moshe coming back and not even realizing, according to Chizkuni, the impact that he was now going to have on everybody that was around him. So we have on the one hand Moshe as the leader, but in this week's Parsha, he is basically the same as everyone else. He struggles. He's trying to say to God, look, we need your help. We need something. I find this moment to be so passionate. You can hear the angst in Moshe's voice as he's saying, please, God, just give me something to take back to them. Give me something to be able to show your presence. And we still struggle with that to this day. Yeah.
Well, I think there were also a number of other things they were struggling with. One was that, well, when they were in Egypt, they had the portents and the miracles and all this amazing stuff was happening. They cross over. Now there's wars. They don't have the food, all the complaining. So that was kind of tough for them, that just that whole thing that we've already talked about a lot. But the other thing is now they're also among all these other nations, and these other nations have these asherot, and they have the ones they're worshiping, and it's like, and I think that also speaks to human nature, that we kind of look around, we see, well, this one has this, and this one has this, and especially in today's world on social media, it's like, oh, well, they're going here, so they must be doing really well. So I think and that's why he also, like right before all this, or is it the paragraph before, he says, you got to tear all that stuff down.
Right.
Now it's me. Now we
Right.
have to set this, we have to establish this. But then also,
Well, it's also where they came from, Diana, right? It's where they came from. It's going back to that mentality of Egypt.
the door Hagar.
Right.
Exactly. And then, but the other thing that's just so cool is the whole thing with the veil. That's what I was thinking a lot about, all different kinds of boundaries. He's got the veil on when he talks to them, but then he takes it off when he's with God. And then, spoiler for next week, by Yachel, then even though some of them are afraid, he's still able to gather all of them up, which
Right.
is amazing.
Right. And that is a good lead-in into next week, that after this, Moshe brings everybody together, right, and shares what it is that he was able to derive from this moment. Mark,
Can I take another approach to
please.
reading it? So the first time Moses received the tablets, it was passive. Everything was given to him. The second time, he actually had to take the words, internalize it, write it himself. So it's more active.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion of when you take in knowledge, it's a part of you.
Mm.
And you have the ability to then radiate it or project it out to
Love
other
it.
people. And to me, that's another approach to this.
Love it. Mark's midrash on this, which I think is great, is, the first time the Ten Commandments were given, it was a passive sort of moment that God did everything. This time, Moshe had to do it, and by doing so, we're internalizing that, and Moshe was then changed because of that. Because of that internalization, Moshe now reflected out and was able to reflect back to everyone else, and they literalized this, right? They turned this into a literal radiance and reflection of that knowledge that Moshe now had acquired. I like that. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. This week's Parsha is one of, I would argue, the most human parshiot that we have. It talks about our human frailties with the golden calf, talks about the fact that we make mistakes, sometimes big ones, but it also talks about this longing that you see all the way through this struggle. The fact that having a relationship with God is not easy. Having a relationship, by the way, with anybody is not easy. Let's just say that. It takes work. It takes effort. But having a relationship with God is not easy. And we struggle at it. And we fail sometimes. And that we see as really occurring almost immediately after the giving of the Ten Commandments. And it allows us, as human beings thousands of years later, to be okay with the struggle. To be okay with the struggle. Some days are going to be easier, some days are going to be more difficult, some days we're going to feel that presence of God, some days we're going to be radiating it and we're not even going to know. We're not even going to know. We don't know the impact that we had on somebody else. Just like Hiskuni said, that's part of what it means to be a human being in search of this relationship with God. All right.